been a while since I've actually done a video where I've just kind of had to sit down and talk with people. You know, it's very difficult for me to do these, given that I don't really get a chance to sit down much. Heck, even just last week, you know, there was the whole incident in which I got assaulted by some guy up in Scotland, ended up homeless for a bit, and then had to bounce back to where I am now. At least I picked up this old monitor. This is gonna go nicely in my, like, game dev office whenever I get the chance to actually set up a game dev office. Actually, I've owned this for ages. I left it at a friend's place. In fact, that's where I am right now. And, like, I don't even know where I'm actually going to be. Still, like, I'm just on my friend's couch right now. I really don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, all that aside, I just wanted to do a really dumb video where I talked about something just really stupid. So I figured that as a relevant topic, I could talk a little bit about game development. Or more specifically, certain things that I do while I'm game development, such as controller support. So I've been developing my game for quite a long time, and when I started, it was just sort of, you know, I was putting together just a general engine, just making it function, all that kind of stuff. Eventually, it kind of got to my attention that if I was going to take this seriously, I wanted to actually implement controller support. I think the other thing behind that was because I was going to be starting to take it to, like, conventions and stuff, I was going to be doing all sorts of showings of it. But of course, I couldn't do showings like what I did over at PAX if I didn't have controller support. I mean, I guess I could have just had a keyboard laid out for people to just come up with, but that's just really weird, especially when we're talking about a 2D platformer that people are just going to pick up and play. It really does give much less of an accessibility factor if I can't just have people come over and pick up and play the game. And just in general, it's like, I like the idea of being able to play it on controllers. If I want to ever port this to other consoles, like, I'm gonna have to get myself used to controllers at some point. Now, for the most part, doing controller work is actually quite simple. It's just a case of every button that is pressed is just assigned a number. It's like, I think on this particular controller, I think it might be that one is button 1, this one's 2, 3, 4, and then it just goes along to all of them until it's counted up all the buttons, and then these things that are on axis, it's just like, it'll just give an angle variable, and to get an intensity on how far the analog stick is actually pushed, that's a little bit of a more complicated thing, but thankfully I don't have to deal with it because I'm a 2D platformer designer, unless, I guess I could have to deal with it if I wanted to ever do like, minor things, but to be fair, it's like, definitely not something that I have to worry about right now. So for the most part, assigning controls is very much the same as just doing it for keyboard. Instead of doing, like, you know, button X or whatever is pressed, you just do button 1 is pressed. It's not too much harder in that regard. It gets really complicated when you start trying to work in multiple controllers, though. Different ones have very different ways of operating, and I found that out by pulling my hair out on quite a few very frustrating weekends. I really like this controller, actually. I got it in Texas while I was getting ready for PAX, and it does this thing where it, like, shines in all sorts of different colors and whatnot. In fact, I can even change it by, like, doing this thing and, like, just I don't even remember how I actually did the look at those different colors. I think the biggest problem is the difference between Xbox controllers and standard controllers, which I think in technical terms is referred to as X input and D input, which, to be fair, is not too much different. The main sticking point, and the frustrating one at that, is the fact that Xbox controllers have very different ways that they work the triggers, and whew, I would say that I am very triggered by these triggers. Now, one thing that I would say about programming for controllers is just pick one. Don't be like me and try and do both at the same time. I mean, it's possible, but, like, you are going to give yourself a headache. I would say that most developers nowadays use Xbox controllers, and the biggest reason for that is consistency. Now, one thing that I can credit the Xbox controller on is the fact that it's consistent. Like, you are always going to have the same buttons be in the same places, and that makes things really easy for developing, especially if you want your players to have a very specific control set. It's all set out rather consistently, and whilst your users might have different types of Xbox controllers, the buttons and such will always be in the same place, which is very useful. I would say that a majority of developers use the Xbox controller for this exact reason, but if you want to have a much more freely mapped controller, the Xbox controller kind of falls apart. The biggest sticking point is these triggers, and as I mentioned before, I don't like them. Now, the main problem behind the triggers, I mean, these are transparent, so you could probably even see it, but the main problem behind these triggers is the fact that there's no actual button behind them. All the triggers are is just an intensity meter which is really awkward because the rest of the controller is a button. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it goes button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's no button thing for these. They are just intensity things, which means that if I have to, if I want to have something that is a button, like if I wanted to have remappable controls where someone could be like, oh yeah, maybe I want to have this thing be on the trigger. I can't do that because to put it on the trigger, I would then have to be like, okay, for this action, you're gonna have to listen for either a button press or just this slight intensity on the trigger, and it's just another really annoying thing is not only are these not buttons at all, but intensity sensors, but they are intensity sensors on the same scale. What this means is that the left trigger and the right trigger will measure an intensity from here to here, meaning that if you have this one pressed, it will be all the way over here, and if you have this one pressed, it will be all the way over here. If neither are pressed, it's going to be here, but if both are pressed, it is also going to be here. Which means that you can't press both of these at the same time, which again, really hurts your ability to freely map these controls. So if you don't want to deal with any of that hassle, you've got your D-input controller, which I think this is just some random thing that I picked up for like $10 somewhere, and I mean, it gets the job done. And the nice thing about D-input controllers is the fact that everything is a button. Everything that you can press on this is a button, including the triggers. They're all buttons. I have noticed that some D-input controllers, such as a GameCube USB controller that I actually have, which I left over in Texas, that one actually does have intensity sensors on the triggers. But it also has a button there, which I can't for the life of me figure out why this doesn't. To be honest, I do actually like having D-input controllers, but one of the biggest disadvantages of these is the fact that there is no consistency in how they work whatsoever. Like I was saying with the Xbox controllers, no matter what model you have, you know that the A button is the A button. You can't guarantee that with the D-input controller. There's a good chance that someone could plug in a controller on your game and find that the A button is like this one, and like, you can't really predict that because it's just gonna depend on whatever model of controller that they have, which could be freaking billions of them. This inevitably means that you will have to have some kind of controller reconfig menu on your game, which, to be fair, I feel like is the kind of thing that most games should have anyway. Personally, I do prefer the freedom of these because whilst it does require me to have some kind of level of configuration on my controllers, I can account for that, and also, these are just a lot easier to work with because the Xbox controllers doesn't even have a button on the triggers. Now, when I was programming my game, I actually went to try and give compatibility for both, which, don't do that. Please do not do that. Because as I said before, to work with a D-input controller, it is practically required to have a controller config menu, which is like the one thing that is very difficult to implement for a controller where two of the buttons, two very important buttons mind you, can't be mapped in the same way as all the others. So I have to create a whole bunch of workarounds just to make this work, especially because I do actually have certain controls which I feel are probably more appropriate for triggers. Now, the biggest workaround that I could find was just to make sure that, firstly, I identify if the controller is an Xbox controller. Secondly, if that is the case, then make sure that only certain actions are able to be programmed to the triggers, and that was mostly just because of the fact that I could not be bothered to program everything to work with that compatibility. And secondly, that of anything that's put onto those triggers, only one thing can be programmed to either trigger at any point. The game will effectively see a left or right trigger as the same button as far as clashes on the controller menu go, and it'll just not let you do it. It does lead to an awkward and amusing glitch that I'll have to work out at some point, in which if you try and map a trigger onto one of the actions and then remap it onto something that clashes, but the trigger itself can't actually be mapped to that certain action because the triggers are banned for certain controls, it'll just set no button for that particular action, which I guess is kind of funny. realistically not game-breaking, but probably something I should find a workaround for. Ultimately, though, I want to make my game as accessible as possible, and I think that it's worth it, and I have a lot of fun doing what I'm doing. I find this very interesting, though, and I think the processes of game development are something that are very underappreciated, and something that's still worth sharing, so there'll probably be other topics that I'll have to discuss along these lines, so stay tuned and subscribe to see more. Also, for anyone interested in the actual projects that I do, the links will be all over the place, and also I have a Discord server where you can come and say hi to me. So, yeah, thanks for watching. Now, one thing that I found is that if you're trying to program for controllers, like, just pick one. Oh, god damn it!